Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about China's economy, what's going on, because I threw up a quick little post on LinkedIn, so not a video, but just like a little post mentioning if you're interested in economics, please go look at China's economy and go look at Sri Lanka's economy. And I just let it kind of sit there. And I know there are a lot of people that watch my channel and go, oh, Dimitri, I don't like, that you're right-winged, as they call me, which is quite ironic because I'm a libertarian. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. And so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about China, a little bit about Sri Lanka. We're going to throw in a little bit about Canada, but I'm going to look at this more from an economic standpoint. And I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole of bashing different countries or talking about what I do and don't like about them. As you can imagine, as a libertarian, I'm not the biggest fan of communism, which is, the structure of China. But let's ignore all that. Let's just go down and talk a little bit about what's going on, what's kind of been going on. This video is not made to be like an in-depth educational video with a bunch of points. It's really just me explaining kind of what's going on and why this is important globally and why this is important for the US. So let me just dive into this here for a second. Okay, so China itself has been in a tight economic situation here, and it's not separated from the rest of the globe. So the pandemic itself has negatively impacted a lot of countries. The lockdowns that did happen during the pandemic were quite damaging to supply chain, for example. And on top of this, China continues to have lockdowns and continues to be quite excessive on trying to control things. And I kind of get it because they have, so many people. But from a freedom perspective, from economic growth perspective, it's not necessarily the best idea to lock things down out of fear that there's going to be spread and disease. And no, the world's not going to end from COVID. So that's kind of a challenging point here that all the countries have been facing. And, these things negatively impacted the United States. It negatively impacted Europe and South America and Africa and India and all of Asia. And it did the whole world. And the issue with this is that when they did the lockdowns, now I'm going to ignore the health side of this, but when you did the lockdowns economically, it slows down supply. And you end up in this kind of downward spiral in the sense that so basically what happens is you do the lockdown, people consume less because they're locked up, and then businesses sell less goods. And so then they lay off people because they don't need as many people to staff stores, or they can't find anybody, or there's lockdowns and they can't actually sell anything. And this results in, less people with less money now because they're not employed. And then those people that are less employed, they spend less, and so they consume less, and consumption goes down again. And you end up in this spiral now where we have essentially, not enough goods being sold here. So this is kind of a two-edged sword, and this is why inflation is happening. And I think it's kind of ironic the United States keeps talking about inflation as if inflation's only happening in the United States. It is happening globally. So it's kind of ignorant that we think that America is the only place where this is happening. And it's happening because you have supply chain shortages. So there's the famous quote by, Friedman here talking about there's too many dollars chasing too few of goods. We're in a bind here where now we're being hit on both of these points. So the US, the M1 money supply, I think increased like 240% in the spring of 2020. So money supply goes up, too many dollars chasing too few of goods. Now we have lockdowns. Now we have supply chain issues. Now we can't get goods, materials from literally anywhere in the world because the whole world's somewhat locked down with COVID. And now the supply's dropped. So this is kind of an important piece here. Now, China is an extremely critical country globally. So China is the number one country that exports goods to other countries. So the whole world's dependent on China. And at the same time, the United States, I believe, imports like 18, 19%, almost 20% of our, imports are actually coming from China. So we're bringing in about 20% of everything that we're bringing in is coming from China. And of course, those are used for manufacturing and parts and, all kinds of cool stuff that we use. And so because of that, that is creating a supply chain issue. And now this drives inflation in the US, this drives inflation in China. China's suffering miserably because of this as well. Europe's suffering. And then we have, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine going on. And that's a whole other thing, which I'm not even going to touch or talk about. This is just out of my realm. And anyway, so China itself, though, China's having this problem. And as they keep locking things down, as they keep having these issues, This is reducing the supply of goods. So this is one main driver from what's been going on. Now, the second main driver is housing. And again, we're going to talk about this in the perspective of the United States and China. So China's housing market was booming, right? That was the spot where the wealthy were putting their money. And many investors, from numbers I've seen, had like 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate. And the United States is having similar issues where we're having supply chain issues. And so goods, materials can't be found to build things. If anybody's been following this channel for any time, you understand that I myself have been building for the last year and a half-ish. And I've had issues finding like, windows, lumber products, shingles. Like I can't find things. Prices are through the roof. So I'm waiting, 12, 14, 16 weeks just to get things. So I'm feeling this here in the US, but everybody globally is having this struggle here. And as the economy's booming and inflation's been kicking in, and I would argue that inflation's probably been quite high for some time, because if you don't know, the Federal Reserve here in the United States that tracks inflation in the US constantly rebalances the basket in many ways to kind of keep the number low and keep it where they want. They argue otherwise on why they do that, but that's really why they do it. And so it's seemed lower for a long time. The market's been booming, as we'll put in air quotes, but really prices of everything, including stocks, bonds, corporations, housing, everything has been too high because we have inflation, which is why you see a lot of like the lower income individuals and middle class are really complaining globally. They can't afford to pay for things because we've had inflation for quite some time here. So now China's market gets even worse because real estate became this area where a lot of, individuals, consumers were throwing a lot of their money for investments. And there was a company called Evergrande. So I'm not going to go into all the details of it exactly, but essentially what they did is they brought in a bunch of money. They paid the leases to the government because that's how China operates. And then, they took all this money from investors and we will build you, houses or living quarters, condos, whatever, on this spot of land. And so what happened was, so I'm not going to argue this was fraud and whatever. You can make that argument if you'd like, but I'm not going to jump down that rabbit hole, which I've seen other YouTube channels do. But essentially they took in a bunch of money. And let's say they had, 100 plots or something. And instead of taking that money they were given and building those out, they took that money and they churned that money into buying, say, another 100 plots. And then they took the money from those 100 plots and they churned them into buying like another 400 plots. And so I get this from a business perspective. If you can get enough money up front, you can collect money from other consumers, use that money to buy more and more and more land or lease more land from the government. Government's happy because they're making money off it. The building company's happy because, they're making money off it. And you would hope that eventually all those buildings would get built and the consumers would get their products. So they're taking a risky bet by using those dollars that were supposed to go towards building and buying more land. Now, if you were honest company, which I don't know if they are or not, if they were honest, they would eventually have the intention to pay that back and build those properties. But unfortunately, for a lot of people, they viewed it as a Ponzi scheme in the sense that more and more and more land were being bought. And then that was being rolled into, more and more properties. And then they had no intention to build those, according to people that are making the Ponzi scheme argument. So, either way, what happened was it blew up because they could not make their debt payments. And so people were not making their payments on these mortgages because there was no property there. And China had this really odd financial system where you would essentially pay for the property before it existed. And so you had these prepayments, and then eventually it would be built and you would own it. But of course, Evergrande never finished these and never built these properties. So essentially they took a bunch of money and they couldn't pay their bills because they were just buying up more and more property. And I'm sure there's more to this, like, pay and salary and executives getting paid off and making a ton of money. And of course, what ended up happening was now they couldn't pay all of the different companies they owed and they defaulted on their debt. So this is a piece now. Now, on top of this, China's having runs on the bank. So there was another, I'll call it a scandal, some other issue that occurred where there was a handful of banks that apparently went out and sold a bunch of products. They said were high yield savings accounts, apparently. I don't know if there's fine print that no one read or what the deal was on this, but they went out there and they got all of these different, specialty loan accounts. And then they took all these customers' money. And then what ended up happening is the markets have started to tank. And what ended up, the truth behind this was, no, they weren't being put into high yield savings accounts. these firms actually put these into essentially wealth management products. So there was a risk to it. Now, this is where it all gets kind of dicey and it's kind of fuzzy. And I understand the different perspectives of government and, the consumer, they got screwed and everything. The issue with this is that these are essentially like government backed, like savings is government backed. So like the United States, FDIC backs your savings accounts up to, I think, like $250,000 per account. And so in China, they have a similar system. So that prevents runs on the bank. Now, the issue with this is that China said, okay, we would back them if they were savings accounts. But the issue is those banks that were involved in that lied and told the consumers they were savings accounts, but they were not. They were wealth management products. The government's kind of saying, hey, we don't want to pay all these citizens money back because at the end of the day, it was a wealth management product, not a savings product. Now the customer and the consumers are saying, hey, that's not what I was told. That's not what I signed. I signed this as a savings account, so therefore I should be getting my money back. Now, China's having, essentially things are starting to collapse. The United States government is stretched extremely thin in the US. China's government is stretched extremely thin in China. And so each country has the option to print more money to cover all of these savings accounts. But now we go back to the original issue I talked about globally, which is inflation. So if the government creates, more US dollars or, more Chinese dollars here, I believe they're called wands, then the issue with this is that it's going to drive inflation even more and more and more. And as inflation cycles, you end up in this downward spiral where inflation gets worse and worse and worse. And if you have stagflation, essentially your dollar becomes worthless and nobody believes in the government because, again, we got off the gold standard. So now we're on fiat currency, which means I have a piece of paper. So let's say I have, I don't know, some awesome piece of paper here. And on this piece of paper, if you look at a US dollar, actually, it says essentially it's a note and essentially the government owes you that value. That's what fiat currencies are. They're just a piece of paper that say I owe you something of value. And then we just magically took that thing of value away and said, hey, just trust me, these are worth money because the government backs them. So this is where it gets dicier now because the governments can't really print money because we have inflation. Inflation itself, I don't think is a bad thing, which is contrary to what you're seeing in the media and everyone talking and exciting. The economy is trying to rebound. It's trying to go back to the equilibrium. So what ends up happening now is we have too many dollars and we have too few of goods. And so now people need food and housing and, electronics and all kinds of things. And there's not enough of them available. And there's too many of these dollars or currencies floating around. So what ends up happening is that we're going to have to bid really high prices for these few goods so that the individuals who are willing to pay the most is going to get the good. So the demand for that individual is the highest. And so therefore they will get that good. If people in the United States globally just scaled back and said, hey, I don't need Netflix. And hey, I don't need, a $1,200, $1,300 smartphone. Or hey, I don't need a brand new car and I don't need a brand new house and I don't need new clothes because all of my clothes are great and wonderful and I don't need to get new ones. If everyone just scaled back, what would end up happening is it would start to balance back out where we would soak up these dollars as people kind of spend the dollars. And of course, the United States government should basically destroy a bunch of the dollars that they're getting back because they generated 240% more than we originally had in 2020, which we didn't need. So anyways, that's kind of what's going on with China. China is somewhat in this same situation the United States is in. So I don't see a need to, call names and, oh, they're horrible or whatever. Yes, China's out doing other military things. I'm not going to get into that whole side of the argument in the Chinese issue, but economically, they're just in this bind where they're having runs on the banks. The housing market's crashing. The government doesn't really know, I don't think, what to do at this point because they can't print money to calm the crowd because we have inflation and it's not locked into China. It is happening globally. So globally, we are having issues left, right, and that's just chaos. So that's how it is. Now going into Sri Lanka here, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I don't like to go down this, topic too often, but I made the video on ESG and I talked a little bit about it. And of course I offended some people as usual, which is fine. But the thing with ESG is it's not that environmentalism is good or bad. It's that the way we're going about it is wrong and bad because we're not looking at any of the costs associated with it. So yes, we should save the environment, but doing it logically and reasonably is a key driver here. Now, Sri Lanka is in complete chaos, is melting down. The people are starving to death. And there's essentially like nothing there now. Like it's just the country's exploding. And this is happening, one of the key drivers behind this, and I'm sure there are other drivers like political drivers, but if you look at one of the bans they did, they wanted to be one of these great ESG countries. And I think they were like number 2 on the list. And they were great and wonderful because they got rid of all of their fertilizers, which were a massive, pollutant or environmental factor here. And so they got rid of them. And so when they got rid of them, what ends up happening with this is now they can't grow as much food. And when you can't grow as much food, your people just starve to death. And so this comes from multiple perspectives on this. One being economical. So if they grow food and products and they sell them to the rest of the world, that brings in, currency and value that they are providing for their people, so their people can feed themselves and house themselves and buy clothes and, electronics and other things and education and things they need and healthcare. And what people, again, on the ESG argument, which I've made, that they don't understand is you have to view the cost of doing this. And it's the same concept and the same argument I go over when I argue with people on GMOs. So people go, oh, GMO is horrible and it's ending the world and whatever. Okay, so I went to one of the top schools and I went to the university that I believe is the one that did the GMO modification for wheat, which is WSU, Washington State University. Now, genetically modifying it, what it does is it creates 7 times the amount of wheat from the same plant. So this is just technology and just modifying genes to do things faster and to evolutionize the plant to get it to produce more. So now we have 7 times the food, we can feed 7 times the people. So these are good things, good technologies. These are things that we should be arguing for when we talk about environmentalism. We should argue for things like GMO, where it makes more resistant plants to pests and disease, and it has higher yields, and it requires less fertilizers and less water. There's all kinds of things we can do with GMO, but again, that's bad and nasty, and so we're like hiding it and pretending it doesn't exist, and yet there's not real science going on that side on like, we actually need GMOs to do this. And this ties into Sri Lanka in the sense that Sri Lanka essentially threw out their entire government, threw out all their country's well-being because they banned their citizens from actually using fertilizers to actually produce food here. So now the issue is, even if they're cut off from the world, they can't even produce the food to feed themselves. They need to produce food, to export food, to get US dollars and wons and pounds and pesos and everything else to exchange around the world to bring in goods and services to support Sri Lanka. Now, this is not just unique to Sri Lanka now. Canada is going through a similar phase here in their proposed rules that have not passed. I'll link a video below as well on some of these things like China and Sri Lanka, and this farmer video from a guy in Canada that's talking about this, where they're doing the same thing, where they're just wanting to ban all these fertilizers. And so we go back to, I think, the key issue I have, which is everybody I see that's on the cutting edge of things, from cryptocurrencies to fintech to ESG, they always make this assumption up front that everybody that's currently doing it is dumb and incompetent, has no idea what they're doing. And I know the better because, I'm exciting and I'm a special little snowflake. And so what ends up happening is now we make this assumption everyone's dumb. And so we're going to make all these decisions. And I think that video, which I'll link below, about the farmer makes some great points and things I learned going to university in a farming community, in a farming field. And so you don't realize that they hire like experts to come in and figure out how to minimize the amount of fertilizer they need. The tractors they drive are like super, super crazy expensive. And it's like a lifetime indebtment to pay these things off. But they go in and like the tractor, as it samples and drives, it can tell you like moisture content in the soil. And of course, they bring in these experts to do the fertilization samples. They look at different parts of the field as well. It's not like they just, waltz out there and, scoop up a little bit of dirt in a cup and go, yeah, this is the fertilizer content for, 300 acres or something. No, they go out and they do all these different samplings and tests, and they look at, what nutrients the fields need. And they go through this whole process, and they bring in experts, and they try to figure out how to minimize both chemical use and fertilizer use, chemicals for, like pesticides and things. And they try to do this, one, because it saves them cost. Why would you just dump a bunch of extra money into something you don't need to do? And these, farmers aren't just dumb country bumpkins, which I think is what a lot of people are assuming. A lot of these individuals have been farming for generations. Then they have all the new technology. Then they bring in the specialists. And actually, when I went to, undergrad at a university that focused on farming, a lot of these farmers go and get like soil science degrees, or they get like agricultural degrees. There's degrees for this. So it's not like, they're just dumping, pounds and pounds of fertilizer everywhere. So the Sri Lankan thing, it looks like is going to be spreading to Europe. It is going to be spreading to Canada. I'm just hoping it doesn't come to the US. But again, it comes back to these things of how do we solve environmental problems logically and cost effectively? We can't just say that, we just do it at all costs. We don't care if a bunch of people, I look at like people yelling and screaming about, environmentalism right now. And yet, they're saying the world's going to end in 10 years or 20 years, whatever. Sri Lankan people right now are just dying and starving today, not in 10 to 20 years. It's like saying, would you want to die today or in 10 to 20 years? Like the 10 to 20 year argument on environmentalism prediction of global warmings has been the big boogeyman that we've all been kind of chasing after for decades now, probably 50, 60 years. And yet magically the planet hasn't ended. So again, there's just too much hype around it. They're not looking at the core consequences with this, with the economic crises happening with China and the US and Europe, the wars that are going on, the geopolitical tensions that are going on between the countries. We're just in this really, really bad economic environment. And I find it quite entertaining that I'll end the episode on this. I find it quite entertaining that everybody keeps saying, Dimitri, we are not going to hit a recession or like a crisis. And I say, how do you know that? And they said, because look at the economy, look around. It is amazing. It is better than it's ever been in the last, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I look at them just thinking, what do you think happens before we crash? We're at the all-time high. You have to be at the high to have the crash. You can't be like, floating in the middle and you kind of like dip and wave and like, oh, it kind of sinks and it kind of floats and then we kind of go back up. No, an economic crisis and a crash is going to occur when you're at the peak. So just throwing those 2 cents out there. Just some things to think about here. Again, guys, look economically, look globally. This is not just happening just in your country, just in your part of the world. We are in a real tight bind here. And a lot of this is driven by COVID and the reactions to COVID by governments. And then there's also just been some corruption occurring and there's been, businesses and money. We're just kind of in that prime where money's just been too free for the last, 5, 10 years, maybe 20 years. And because of that, it's kind of driven some corruption and some other issues as well around the world. So not just in one country, but in many countries. So anyways, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And as always, until next time.